There is a particular kind of humiliation that only a man in love can inflict on himself, and Daniel Ferris achieved his personal record for it on a Tuesday morning in April, in the flower-choked back room of Blut and Duft, Vienna's most stubbornly old-fashioned florist shop. "Don't move," William said. "I'm not moving. You're vibrating. That counts." Daniel gritted his teeth and held very still while William Falkenrath, 6'3" of him, dressed like he'd wandered out of a boardroom and gotten lost among the ranunculus, knelt in front of him with a pair of shears in one hand and an expression of profound concentration on his face, as though he were diffusing something rather than attempting, badly, to free Daniel's sleeve from a wire trellis. "How?" Daniel asked to the ceiling. "Does the Alpha King of Tyrol not know how to cut a single piece of florist's wire? I know how to cut wire. I am choosing to be careful because the last time I was not careful, I cut a hole in your apron and you sulked about it for a week." "I did not sulk. You made me a card. It said 'I forgive you' in glitter pen. That was affection. That was extortion with a glitter pen," William said, and finally, the wire gave, and Daniel's arm came free, and he stumbled forward directly into William's chest, which was as ever unfairly solid, like walking into a very expensive, very warm wall. William's arms closed around him out of pure reflex, and for one unguarded second neither of them moved, the shop's antique bell tinkling somewhere out front, the smell of hyacinth and wet stone, and William's cologne folding over Daniel like a held breath. Then the door to the back room banged open, and a voice that Daniel had come, over 11 months, to associate with imminent chaos, said, "Well, isn't this cozy?" Lucas Brandt stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of red roses, so large it looked structurally unsound. His blonde hair windswept in a way that suggested he had checked a mirror recently and approved. Lucas had been trying to court Daniel, unsuccessfully, since Christmas, operating on the apparent theory that persistence was a substitute for being noticed. "I brought you flowers," Lucas said, holding out the roses as though this were not, in fact, the single strangest gift anyone could give a florist. Daniel opened his mouth to explain, gently for the 11th time, that William was. He never got the chance. William, without breaking eye contact with Lucas, reached behind himself with the unhurried calm of a man reaching for a coffee cup, picked up a lit pillar candle from the display table, and set the entire bouquet on fire. The shop's smoke alarm went off 9 seconds later. It took 4 minutes, one dented ficus, and Daniel shouting the word insurance at increasing volume for the fire to actually go out, by which point Lucas had fled into the street trailing the smell of singed rose petals, and Daniel's boss, Mira, was standing in the doorway with a spray bottle in one hand and murder in her eyes. "He set my roses on fire," Daniel said to her, faintly, once the smoke had cleared. "I set his roses on fire," William corrected, entirely unrepentant, brushing a fleck of ash off his sleeve with the air of a man who had done nothing wrong and would, if given the chance, do it again immediately. "There's a difference." "There is not a difference, William. They were roses. They don't have citizenship." "He was flirting with you in your own workplace. He was badly flirting with me. You could have just stood there being terrifying, which you're extremely good at, instead of committing arson." "I panicked," William said, which was, Daniel would reflect later, the single most absurd sentence he had ever heard a 210-pound wolf shifter with a private security detail say out loud. Mira, arms crossed, looked between them for a long moment. "You two," she said finally, "are going to give me a heart attack before I turn 30. Clean up the candle wax, both of you. And Daniel," she caught his sleeve as William slunk off toward the storeroom to find a fire extinguisher he had, evidently, only just remembered existed. "You're smiling. You've got soot on your face and your boyfriend just committed a minor felony in my shop and you are smiling." Daniel touched his own cheek, startled to find it was true. "Yeah," he admitted, "I am. It hadn't always been like this. 6 months ago, if you'd told Daniel Ferris that he'd end up hopelessly, helplessly in love with the most infamous, most guarded, most insufferable man in Vienna's old wolf nobility, that he'd be standing in a flower shop full of smoke, laughing instead of screaming, he'd have laughed in your face. But that was the trouble with beginnings. You never recognized them while they were happening. You only understood, much later, looking back, exactly which small and foolish moment had been the hinge the rest of your life swung on. For Daniel, it had been a glass of spilled wine, an ill-fitting borrowed suit, and a man with a white wolf's eyes, standing very still in the middle of a crowded ballroom, looking at him like he'd just been handed something he didn't know he wanted. Later that same smoke-hazed afternoon, once the fire extinguisher had been located, deployed, and, William insisted, used correctly, "Thank you, I read the label this time." Daniel found himself sweeping ash off the counter while his fiancée stood in the doorway looking, for the first time all day, faintly sheepish. "You could apologize to Mira," Daniel said, not looking up, "properly. Not the version where you explain why it was justified. I already sent her a case of the good candles, the ones that don't, statistically, cause this exact problem." "That's not an apology, that's a bribe with better packaging." "It worked on you," William pointed out, and Daniel swatted him with the broom, which William caught, laughing, hauling him in by the handle until Daniel gave up and let himself be pulled, ash-streaked and exasperated and completely, hopelessly fond into the solid warmth of him. "You are the single most ridiculous Alpha King in the history of Tyrol," Daniel informed his collarbone. "I'll have that engraved," William said. "On the desk I still owe my father a replacement for." It was, Daniel thought, tucking his face against William's chest and breathing in ash and hyacinth and the particular warm smell that was only ever William, a strange life he'd landed in, smoke alarms and burnt roses, and a man who apparently expressed devotion through minor property damage. He wouldn't have traded a single ridiculous inch of it. 6 months earlier, in October, Daniel Ferris had never set foot in the Falkenrath townhouse, had never heard the name William Falkenrath spoken, except in the hushed, half-frightened way people in Vienna spoke of the old packs. Families whose blood ran centuries deep and whose fortunes had outlasted empires, who still, on the coldest nights of winter, ran through the black spruce forests of Tyrol on 4 legs instead of 2. He was there because Mira had insisted, dragging him along to cater the flower arrangements for a charity gala at the Palais Ferdinand, and because the actual delivery boy had come down with the flu, leaving Daniel, in a suit borrowed from Mira's cousin, 2 sizes too big through the shoulders, to carry the last of the centerpieces in himself. The Palais Ferdinand at night was a different world from the one Daniel knew, gilt mirrors doubling every candle flame into 100 small suns, the air thick with perfume and cigar smoke, and the low murmuring hum of old money-making small talk. Daniel, who had spent the last 2 hours assembling centerpieces in a cramped service kitchen that smelled of floor wax and simmering veal stock, felt distinctly like an intruder the moment he stepped through the ballroom's side doors. His borrowed jacket pinching at the shoulders, his shoes half a size too small, the whole glittering room regarding him, he was fairly sure, the way one regards a moth that has wandered too close to the chandeliers. He was concentrating so hard on not dropping 4 dozen white orchids that he did not see the man step out of a side door until it was too late, and the whole disastrous, gorgeous weight of the centerpiece tipped, and a full glass of red wine. Someone else's, abandoned on a passing tray, caught by his elbow, went directly down the front of a stranger's very expensive black coat. There was a silence of the kind that swallows a room whole. The man looked down at the spreading stain, then up at Daniel, and Daniel had exactly enough time to register 3 things: that the stranger was extremely tall, that his eyes were an odd pale gold that seemed to catch the chandelier light like an animal's, and that several nearby guests had gone very, very quiet in a way that suggested Daniel had just done something significantly worse than ruin a coat. "I am so sorry," Daniel said, already grabbing napkins off the nearest table, dabbing uselessly at fabric that was clearly beyond saving. "I'll pay for the cleaning, I'll pay for a new one if I have to, the tray and the orchids, and I didn't see you, I'm really—" "It's wine," the stranger said. His voice was low, unhurried, faintly amused in a way that did not match the stiffness in his shoulders. "Not blood, I'll survive. Your coat might not." "My coat," the man said, glancing down at it with something almost like relief at having a reason to look away from the small crowd now watching them, "was a gift from someone I don't particularly like. Consider this an improvement." Daniel laughed before he could stop himself, a short, startled bark of a sound, and the stranger's mouth twitched, just slightly, at one corner. "You're not supposed to laugh at your own crime scene," the man said. "You're not supposed to be charming about having wine dumped on you. It's throwing off my whole apology. Start again, then. Properly." "I am so sorry," Daniel repeated, with theatrical solemnity, sketching an actual bow, orchids and all, "That I have ruined your coat, sir, and possibly your evening, and I don't actually know who you are, which is either going to make this better or catastrophically worse." Something shifted in the stranger's face. Surprise, Daniel thought. Real surprise, quickly smoothed over. "William," the man said, and offered his hand. "Just William, for tonight." Daniel didn't know then that no one at that party had heard William Falkenrath introduce himself by first name alone in over a decade. He didn't know that the entire alpha nobility of the Austrian Alps was currently pretending not to stare at their reclusive heir, shaking hands with a florist's assistant covered in orchid pollen and spilled Merlot. He only knew that William's hand was warm, and that when their palms met, something in his chest did something complicated and unfamiliar, like a held breath finally let go. "Daniel," he said, "I work at Blut und Duft. I'm usually less flammable, chaos-wise." "I doubt that," William said, and there, again that almost smile. "I think you might be exactly this chaotic all the time, and the wine was just the first thing I happened to witness. Rude. Accurate. Those aren't mutually exclusive." William laughed then, really laughed, a short surprise sound that made two elderly guests nearby turn to stare in open astonishment, as though a marble statue had coughed, and Daniel understood. With the sudden dizzy clarity of a man standing at the edge of something enormous, that he badly, badly wanted to hear that sound again. He did hear it again, 3 days later, when William Falkenrath walked into Blut und Duft wearing a plain grey coat, no security in sight, and asked, with the awkward formality of a man reading off an index card he'd memorized and then discarded, whether Daniel would consider having coffee with him as an apology for making you feel responsible for a coat that was, in retrospect, ugly. "You're apologizing to me? I ruined your coat." "I'm choosing to reframe it as a service," William said, and Daniel decided, right then, standing among the tulips with pollen on his hands and his heart doing something entirely unreasonable, that he liked this man, this strange, careful, unexpectedly funny man who apparently set fire to nothing, yet but clearly meant to burn down every assumption Daniel had ever made about Vienna's old money. Coffee became dinner, became long walks along the Donaukanal where William talked, haltingly at first and then with more ease, about the weight of a title he'd never asked for. Alpha King, heir to the Falkenrath pack, a role that had been decided for him before he was born, in a language of duty and bloodline that had never once asked what he wanted. Daniel talked about his mother, who'd raised him alone above a bakery in the 9th district, and who had died 3 winters ago, still believing her son would do something extraordinary, though neither of them had ever known what. "You work in a flower shop," William said one evening, not unkindly, as they sat on a bench with the black water sliding by. "Is that the extraordinary thing, or are you still waiting?" "I used to think I was waiting," Daniel admitted, watching a swan navigate the dark. "Lately, I'm not so sure. Lately, it feels like maybe I already found it and just didn't recognize the shape of it yet." He wasn't looking at William when he said it, but he felt William go very still beside him, the particular stillness of an animal that has just heard something it didn't expect. "Daniel." William's voice had dropped, gone rough at the edges. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand it's not a small thing where I come from." Daniel turned to look at him. In the lamplight, William's pale eyes had gone almost silver, and for the first time since they'd met, Daniel saw something like fear in them, not of Daniel, but of what he was about to say. "My kind mate once," William said. "Not date, not marry lightly and unmarry later if it doesn't work. Mate. Once, and it is written into what we are, into the wolf under the skin, and it does not go away, and it does not choose someone convenient or someone my father would approve of." He exhaled, long and unsteady. "I have known you 3 weeks, Daniel Ferris, and I already know." "Know what?" Daniel asked, though his pulse was answering the question before his mind had caught up. "That it's you," William said, simply, helplessly, like a confession beaten out of him by something larger than himself. "That whatever this is, however inconvenient, however impossible my father is going to find it, it's already you. It was you the second you ruined my coat and made me laugh for the first time in longer than I want to admit." The kiss that followed was not their first. That had happened 2 nights earlier, brief and startled, outside Daniel's apartment door, but it was the first that felt like a door swinging fully open rather than cracking. William's hand came up to cradle the back of Daniel's neck like something precious and easily broken, and Daniel felt it everywhere. In the roar of the canal beside them, in the cold October air gone suddenly warm, in the specific, terrifying joy of being chosen entirely and without conditions by someone who had every reason in the world to choose someone else. "Okay," Daniel breathed when they finally broke apart, both of them a little stunned. "Okay. It's you too. God help me, it's you too." Neither of them, in that moment, wrapped in lamplight and cold air and the astonishing new fact of each other, thought to wonder what William's father would say. They would find out soon enough. But first, there was the matter of Felix. Felix Aldner was William's cousin on his mother's side. A lean, restless beta with a perpetual grin and absolutely no sense of when a joke had gone on 2 beats too long, who had appointed himself, uninvited, as chief chronicler of William's love life the moment he caught wind of it. "So let me get this straight," Felix said, dropping uninvited into the chair across from Daniel at a cafe near the Stephansdom 2 days after the canal, stirring 3 sugars into an espresso with the focus of a man diffusing a bomb. William Falkenrath, the man who once made a diplomat cry by correcting his Latin, actually cried, at a canal bench because a florist told him he'd found the extraordinary thing. "I don't think he cried," Daniel said, though he was smiling into his coffee. "He absolutely cried. I have known that man since we were 7. He does this thing where his ears go red first. It's a tell. He can't hide it." Felix leaned in, delighted. "I need you to know I am fully in favor of this. I have been trying to get him to smile at something that wasn't a quarterly earnings report for years. You've done in 3 weeks what an entire Pack Council couldn't do in a decade." "He set fire to a bouquet a rival brought me, 4 months from now, apparently," Daniel said, half to himself, still slightly disbelieving of his own life. "Wait, what?" "Nothing. Future problem." "You're speaking in riddles and I like it," Felix said, delighted. "Keep going. This is the best gossip I've had since Aunt Greta's wedding toast." Daniel didn't yet know how thoroughly Felix would come to matter. A steady, ridiculous, endlessly loyal presence, who would 8 months later be the one pacing the hospital hallway with William, holding his coat, threatening to fight the vending machine when it ate his coins during the worst of the contractions. He only knew that afternoon, watching this stranger talk about William with such open, easy affection, that whatever this new life was shaping up to be, it wouldn't be lonely. The Falkenrath estate outside Innsbruck sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with black pines, a house of pale stone and steep dark roofs that looked, Daniel thought as the car pulled up, less like a home and more like something built specifically to be difficult to warm. Inside, the dining hall was all dark wood and hunting tapestries, a long table set with more forks than Daniel had names for, and portraits of unsmiling Falkenrath ancestors lining the walls in heavy gilt frames, watching, or so it felt, with identical cold appraisal. Conrad Falkenrath was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. He had built an empire, the Falkenrath Group, shipping and steel, and, more quietly, 3 centuries of pack law, on the principle that a sufficiently cold silence was more effective than any shout, and when William brought Daniel to the family's Innsbruck estate for the first time in December, that silence settled over the dinner table like frost. "A florist," Conrad said at last, turning his wine glass slowly by its stem, not looking at Daniel at all, as though addressing an empty chair. "Your mother's line goes back to Charlemagne, William, and you've brought home a man who arranges carnations for a living." "His name is Daniel," William said, low and even, though Daniel could feel the tension radiating off him like heat off a stove. "And he has a name because he's a person, not a line item." "I'm aware he's a person," Conrad said, finally looking at Daniel with an expression of polite, devastating disinterest, the kind reserved for something one has already decided is beneath negotiation. "I'm simply uncertain what kind of person marries into an Alpha King's line for." A small pause, precisely aimed. Advancement. Daniel's face went hot. Beside him, William's chair scraped back so hard it nearly toppled. "That's enough," William said. "It's fine," Daniel said quietly, though it was not in fact fine, and his hands had gone tight and cold in his lap. "Mr. Falkenrath, I didn't know your son's title existed until 3 months ago. I still don't fully understand it. I make flower arrangements for a living because I love it, and because my mother taught me, and because it's honest work, whatever you think of it." "How touching," Conrad said, and rose from the table, unhurried, unbothered, a man who had decided the conversation was over before it had properly begun. "William, a word, in private." What was said in that private word Daniel never fully learned. William refused, gently but firmly, to repeat all of it, saying only that his father had made his position extremely clear and that Daniel wasn't to worry about it. But Daniel saw the way William's jaw stayed tight for the rest of the drive back to Vienna, the way his hand found Daniel's on the gear shift and held on like it was the only fixed point in a spinning room. "He'll come around," William said, somewhere on the dark mountain road, more to convince himself than Daniel. "He has to." Daniel, watching the black pines blur past the window, said nothing, because he had already understood something William, in his hope, had not yet let himself see, that some fathers did not come around, that some silences were not frost that thawed, but stone. There was, at least, one bright thread in that grim week. The kind of small, absurd comedy that Daniel would come to realize always seemed to find William, like static electricity finding a doorknob. It happened 3 days after the dinner, when William insisted on picking Daniel up from the shop, instead of letting him take the tram, and arrived to find a delivery driver named Sven leaning against the counter, laughing rather too easily at something Daniel had said. One hand braced on the same counter Daniel was standing behind. William, who had spent the entire drive over composing a calm, measured apology for his father's behavior, took one look at this scene, set his jaw, and proceeded to stand in the doorway for a full 4 minutes in total silence, arms crossed, radiating the specific chill of a man who did not technically own the shop, but had very much decided he owned the general vicinity of Daniel. "Can I help you?" Sven asked eventually, unnerved. "No," William said. "Okay. I'm just standing here." "Sure." He did not stop standing there until Sven, increasingly rattled, remembered an urgent delivery 3 streets over and left at what could generously be called a brisk walk. "That was deeply unnecessary," Daniel said, once the bell above the door had stopped ringing. "He was standing very close to you. He was leaning on a counter, William. It's a small shop. Everyone stands close to the counter. I didn't like his posture. You don't like anyone's posture around me. That's not a real complaint." "It's a very real complaint," William said, entirely serious, pulling Daniel into a hug that was somehow both an apology and not one at all. "I've had a terrible day. Let me have this one small, unreasonable victory." Daniel, laughing despite everything, despite the cold weight still sitting in his chest from dinner with Conrad, let himself be held, and thought that this, at least, this ridiculous, jealous, entirely disproportionate devotion, was a kind of proof his own that no dinner table full of silence could take from him. He decided that night that it didn't matter. He loved William Falkenrath, the version of him that set fire to bouquets out of jealousy, the version that laughed like something rusty finally working loose, the version that held Daniel's hand on a dark road like it was the only warm thing in the world. If Conrad Falkenrath's approval was the price of admission to some cold marble life Daniel had never asked to join, then Daniel would simply live without it. He did not yet know how much that decision would cost him. He did not yet know that in 8 weeks everything would change again, and this time there would be no clever line, no ruined coat, no laugh to soften the blow, only a small white stick with 2 pink lines, and a truth about his own body he had never been told, and a fear so large it swallowed the whole bright shape of his happiness whole. Daniel had chalked the exhaustion up to winter, and the strange new tenderness in his chest up to falling in love for the first time in his adult life, and it was Mira, sharp-eyed and endlessly practical, who finally cornered him in the shop's back room in early February and asked bluntly, when he'd last actually eaten a full meal without feeling sick halfway through it, "You've gone through an entire box of ginger biscuits this week," she said, arms crossed, in the tone of a woman building a case. "You fell asleep standing up yesterday, Daniel, standing up like a horse." "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying maybe see a doctor before you fall into the cooler." There was, Daniel would later learn, an old truth in the bloodlines of the Alpha packs, one so rare and so carefully unspoken that most humans who married into wolf families never encountered it at all. Once in a great while, when a mate bond ran deep and true on both sides, the human partner's body changed to meet it. It was not common. William himself had never expected it, had never even thought to warn Daniel, because the odds, his family physician told them both with visible astonishment, were less than 1 in 10,000. Daniel sat in the doctor's office in February, with his coat still buttoned to his chin, staring at an ultrasound image he did not yet have the vocabulary to understand, and thought, absurdly, of the orchids he'd nearly dropped the night he met William. This is the second time, he thought, half hysterical, that I have had absolutely no idea what I was about to be holding. You're certain, William said to the doctor, his voice gone strange and thin, one hand gripping the back of Daniel's chair so hard his knuckles had whitened. I've run it twice, the doctor said gently. Congratulations, Alpha. Mr. Ferris. William didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he came around the chair, knelt in front of Daniel exactly the way he would, months later, kneel to free him from a trellis wire in a smoke-filled flower shop, and pressed his forehead to Daniel's stomach with a reverence that undid something in Daniel's chest completely. Hi, William said to Daniel's stomach, absurdly, wetly, and Daniel started laughing and crying at the same time, both hands buried in William's dark hair. You're talking to my abdomen. I'm talking to our child, Daniel. Forgive me if I don't have a more sophisticated approach prepared. I found out 4 minutes ago. I love you, Daniel said, apropos of nothing and everything, the words falling out of him with no warning at all, and William went very still, then looked up at him with those pale gold eyes gone bright and unguarded, in a way Daniel had never once seen in 4 months of knowing him. I love you, William said back, rough and certain. I have loved you since you ruined a coat I already hated. Marry me, Daniel, not because of this. His hand spread careful and warm over Daniel's stomach, though God knows I'm glad of it. Marry me because I cannot picture a single year of my life from this point forward that doesn't have you standing in the middle of it. Daniel said yes with his whole chest, no hesitation, no fear yet of what was coming, because in that small white room, with William's forehead pressed to his stomach and his own hands full of William's hair, the future looked like nothing but light. He did not yet know that Conrad Falkenrath would call it, 3 weeks later, when the news reached Innsbruck, an inconvenient accident dressed up as fate, and that the word bride, the word Daniel had let himself, quietly, privately, begin to hope for, would be the very word Conrad used to slam the door shut. The summons came in March, delivered not by William but by a lawyer in a gray suit who arrived at the flower shop with the flat, apologetic manner of a man paid extremely well to deliver bad news. Conrad Falkenrath requested Daniel's presence at the Innsbruck estate, alone. William didn't know. Daniel made that decision, badly, he would later admit, because he'd convinced himself he could fix this quietly, could smooth it over the way he smoothed every difficult thing in his life, with patience and good humor, and the stubborn belief that if you were simply good enough, people eventually came around. He was wrong. Conrad received him in the same dining room, but this time there was no dinner laid, no pretense of hospitality, only a single chair set opposite Conrad's desk like an interview or a trial. You're carrying my grandson, Conrad said without greeting, sliding a folder across the desk with the air of a man discussing shipping tariffs. The doctors have confirmed it. I won't pretend I'm not pleased about that part. The Falkenrath line has waited 3 generations for a natural heir born of a true mate bond. That is not nothing. But, Daniel said, because there was clearly a but coming, sitting in the man's cold posture like a held breath. But you will never be his bride, Conrad said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse. Only the flat, immovable certainty of a man who had already made his decision and was merely informing Daniel of the outcome. The child I will accept gladly, and I will see to it he wants for nothing. You, Mr. Ferris, are a florist's assistant with no bloodline, no standing, and no understanding of what it costs to hold a seat like William's. If he marries you, he loses the confidence of every pack elder in Tyrol, and within a decade, someone circling that weakness will take the crown from him entirely. I have watched it happen before. I will not watch it happen to my son. That's not your decision, Daniel said, low shaking. It's William's, it's mine, it is my decision, Conrad said, because I control the Falkenrath Trust, the Pack Council votes, and every door in this city that will or will not open for the 2 of you and this child. I am prepared to be generous, Mr. Ferris, a home, an allowance, full access to your son. But you will sign papers releasing all claim to William's name and title, and you will do it quietly, before he comes home tonight and does something foolish that we will all regret. Daniel sat very still, one hand pressed flat over the small, still invisible curve beneath his coat, and felt something in his chest crack clean through. Not his heart, not yet, but his certainty, the bright, unshakable hope he'd carried since a lamplit bench by the canal. That love, if it was real enough, simply won. And if I say no, Daniel said. Then you will watch me spend every resource I have making certain William believes staying with you is the thing that destroys him, Conrad said, without heat, without hesitation, a man stating whether. I would rather not. I am asking you to spare us both that. Daniel left the estate that night without signing anything, but without either the courage to tell William the truth. Not yet, not while the wound was still this raw, not while some small, humiliated part of him half believed Conrad might be right. That love this large really might not survive contact with the real, cold shape of the world. He walked home that night through streets slick with early spring rain, the lights of the old city smeared gold and trembling in every puddle, and found that he could not, for the life of him, stop replaying the flat certainty in Conrad's voice. Not cruelty, which he could have fought, but the far heavier weight of inevitability. The sound of a man who had seen this exact story end this exact way before and simply expected the world to agree with him. He told William, 3 days later, that he needed space. He did not say why, only that he needed to think, and William, bewildered, hurt, trying so visibly hard to respect it that Daniel nearly broke and told him everything on the doorstep. Let him go with a kiss to the forehead and a whispered whatever you need, I'm here when you're ready, which somehow made the guilt worse rather than better. He packed his bag and moved into Mira's spare room above the shop, and he let William call 4 times a day and answered none of them, and he told himself, lying awake at 3 in the morning with one hand on his stomach, that this was protecting William, when really, he would understand this only much later. It was simply fear, wearing the coat of nobility, the way it so often does. William found out the truth on a Thursday, in a way that would have been comic if it hadn't nearly broken him. He went to the estate to confront his father about why Daniel had suddenly gone silent, certain there was some misunderstanding he could untangle with enough patience, and found the signed, unsigned, Conrad quickly corrected, still unsigned. Release papers still sitting on his father's desk. Daniel would hear the story later from Mira, who heard it from a courier who'd been in the hallway, that William Falkenrath, Alpha King of Tyrol, heir to 3 centuries of cold marble composure, had picked up his father's antique desk and thrown it, actually thrown it, whole, ledgers and all, into the fireplace, and told Conrad, in a voice the servants described afterward as a voice that did not sound entirely like a man's, that he would burn the entire Falkenrath name to the ground with his own hands before he let his father cost him the one thing in his life he had chosen for himself. Daniel, for his part, had spent those same 4 days in a strange, muted fog, going through the motions of the shop, wrapping stems and trimming thorns with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, while Mira watched him with increasing concern and said nothing, because she had learned, over 3 years of friendship, exactly when pressing him would help, and exactly when it wouldn't. He kept replaying Conrad's voice in his head, flat and certain, and kept catching himself, in quiet moments, pressing a hand to his stomach and murmuring apologies to a child who couldn't yet understand a single word of them. For a fight Daniel was terrified he was already losing simply by being too afraid to have it. He arrived at the flower shop 40 minutes later, soaked from the rain, his eyes gone that unnerving pale gold that meant the wolf under his skin was closer to the surface than usual, and Daniel, who had been dreading this exact conversation for 4 days, rehearsing a dozen versions of it, none of them good enough, opened the door and simply started crying before either of them said a single word. You should have told me, William said, and his voice cracked on it, not with anger, but with something rawer. Daniel, you should have told me. I don't care what he threatened. I don't care what he offered you. Do you understand that there is no version of my life, no title, no pack, no crown, that means anything to me without you standing in the middle of it? I told you that in February. I meant every word. He said if I didn't sign, he'd make you believe staying with me was the thing that destroyed you. Daniel said, the words coming out in a rush, 4 days of held breath finally breaking loose. And some horrible small part of me believed him, William, because look at you, look at what you were born into, and look at me, I fold flowers into wire for a living. I don't know how to be what your world needs. I don't need you to be anything, William said, closing the distance between them, cupping Daniel's face in both hands, rain and all. I need you to be exactly, precisely this, the man who set my whole ridiculous life on fire, the second he spilled wine on a coat I never even liked. My father built an empire out of controlling every room he's ever stood in. I am done letting him control mine. He's not going to just accept us, Daniel whispered. No, William agreed. He's not. So we won't ask him to accept us. We'll ask him to watch, and eventually, one way or another, he'll understand that the pack he's so desperate to protect is stronger with you in it than without. It sounded, that night in the rain-soaked doorway of a shop full of sleeping flowers, like a plan. It would take 4 more months, one furious pack council meeting, and improbably, a white wolf standing guard outside a hospital door in the dead of an August night, for it to actually become one. Somewhere between the rain-soaked reconciliation and the pack council, there was a Tuesday evening that Felix would for years afterward bring up at every possible opportunity, usually right before a toast. It began innocently enough. A prenatal class, recommended by Daniel's midwife, held in a community hall that smelled of chalk dust and lavender oil, attended by 6 other expectant couples and one instructor named Petra, who ran the sessions with the brisk good humor of a woman who had clearly seen every possible variety of nervous partner and was no longer impressed by any of them. William had arrived 20 minutes early, having read, he informed Daniel with total seriousness, that punctuality signaled commitment to the process, and had spent the intervening time arranging their mats with the meticulous care of a man laying siege lines. The trouble started when Petra, demonstrating a breathing technique, asked for a volunteer partner to practice supportive touch, and, before William could so much as straighten in his chair, a cheerful, broad-shouldered man named Otto from the couple 2 mats over leaned across and offered, with entirely platonic and entirely oblivious friendliness, to demonstrate the shoulder massage portion with Daniel, since my Greta's not feeling up to bending today. Daniel, 6 months pregnant and mostly focused on not falling asleep on the mat, said, "Oh, sure, thanks," before he had fully registered the low, dangerous quiet that had descended over the man seated directly behind him. Otto's hands had barely landed on Daniel's shoulders before William, moving with a speed that seemed genuinely unfair for a man his size, had relocated himself from his own mat to directly between them, folded his legs, and announced, with the flat, pleasant tone of a man declaring war, "I'll take it from here, thank you, Otto." "Oh, sure, no problem," Otto said, backing away with his hands raised, clearly sensing something ancient and territorial in the air that his prenatal class small talk had not prepared him for. "You didn't have to do that," Daniel said, torn between laughing and mortification, as William's hands settled, gentle, careful, entirely unnecessary in their thoroughness, onto his shoulders. "He was touching you. He was demonstrating a massage technique, William, that we are both here to learn. I know the technique. I've read 4 books on it. I do not need Otto's assistance." "You've read 4 books on massage. I've read 4 books on everything relevant to the next 3 months, William said, with the wounded dignity of a man who had, in fact, alphabetized a small home library on the subject, and none of them mentioned Otto. Petra, watching this entire exchange from the front of the room with the weary patience of a woman collecting material for a very good story at her next staff meeting, simply said, "Right," moving on to hip circles, and let it go, while the rest of the class dissolved into poorly muffled laughter, and Daniel buried his hot face in his hands, shaking with silent laughter of his own, thoroughly, helplessly charmed despite himself. "You are going to be an absolute menace at the actual birth," Daniel informed him afterward, walking out into the cool evening air, William's hand warm and protective at the small of his back. "I intend to be extremely useful at the actual birth. You intend to fight the obstetrician." "Only if he touches your shoulders without asking first," William said, entirely serious, and Daniel laughed so hard he had to stop walking, one hand braced on William's arm, until the ache in his ribs turned into something warmer, something that felt, in the middle of everything else that spring had cost them, remarkably, stubbornly like joy. The pack council met once a season in a stone hall in Innsbruck that had stood, William told Daniel, since before Vienna itself was a city. 9 elders, Conrad among them, gathered around a table older than most nations, to decide matters no ordinary court had jurisdiction over. The hall itself unsettled Daniel the moment he walked in, high vaulted ceilings blackened by centuries of hearth smoke, the walls hung with old tapestries depicting wolves running through snow-heavy forests, and beneath it all a cold that seemed to rise up out of the stone floor itself, A cold Daniel felt through the soles of his shoes despite the July heat outside. He gripped William's hand tightly, one palm resting against the firm curve of his own stomach, and told himself, silently, over and over, that whatever happened in the next hour, at least Freya, they had already privately chosen the name, would know her father had fought for this in front of everyone, even if the room decided against them. William requested an audience in June, 7 months pregnant Daniel at his side despite Conrad's visible fury at the sight of him, and stood before the 9 elders with a steadiness Daniel would later say was the single bravest thing he'd ever watched another person do. "You all know the old law," William said, "better than I do. A true mate bond, confirmed by a natural heir, the rarest thing our bloodlines produce, cannot be dissolved by a father's preference, only by the mate's own choice. My father has spent 7 months trying to convince you this doesn't apply, because Daniel wasn't born into a pack line. I would ask you to look at the actual law, rather than my father's comfort with it." An elder named Greta Osberg, a formidable woman with silver hair and an expression that suggested she had outlived several kings' worth of patience for exactly this kind of family theater, turned her attention to Daniel. "You understand," she said, not unkindly, "what you're asking to walk into, the scrutiny, the isolation at times. Some of us in this room still remember when the old packs would not even speak the word human without spitting after it." "I understand it's not going to be easy," Daniel said, one hand resting on the curve of his stomach, meeting her eyes without flinching. "I understand your world thinks I'm a mistake wearing a good suit. But I also know what I've watched William become in the last 8 months. Braver, kinder, more himself than his own father ever let him be, and if that's the effect I have on him, then I'd like to think that's worth something too, even to a room full of people counting bloodlines instead of hearts." There was a long silence. Then, astonishingly, Greta Ostberg laughed, a short, surprised, genuinely delighted sound. "Conrad," she said, without looking away from Daniel, "your son has better taste in mates than you had in wine at your own wedding, and God knows that was a low bar." The vote, when it came, was 7-2 in Daniel's favor. Conrad was one of the two. He left the hall without a word, and it would be, Daniel already suspected, a very long road back from that silence. But it was, for the first time since February, a road that existed at all, rather than a door bricked shut. By August, Daniel had grown used to a strange new rhythm to his days, the particular contentment of evenings spent with his feet in William's lap, while Freya, not yet arrived but already thoroughly discussed, kicked insistently against his ribs each time William read aloud from whatever pack history book he'd most recently become obsessed with, as though she already had opinions about 13th century treaty law and wished to register her disapproval. Conrad had begun, awkwardly and without acknowledgement of the shift, sending small gifts, a hand-carved cradle, a set of silver spoons engraved with a wolf crest Daniel didn't yet have the full history of, and Daniel had stopped, mostly, flinching every time the man's name came up in conversation. Their daughter came 3 weeks early, on a hot, restless night in August, with a suddenness that left absolutely no room for William's meticulously prepared hospital bag, his rehearsed breathing exercises, or his composure, all 3 of which fell apart within roughly the same 4 minutes. Daniel, mid-contraction, informed him, with more affection than the words suggested, that if he did not stop pacing and start being useful, Daniel was personally going to set him on fire, at which point some switch in William seemed to flip, and he became, for the next 6 hours, the single steadiest presence in the room, a hand to grip, a voice low and constant in Daniel's ear, murmuring nonsense and encouragement, and, at one memorable point, an entire whispered apology for every candle he had ever lit near flammable objects, as though bargaining with the universe through sheer contrition. Outside the hospital, in the parking structure across the street, a nurse would later swear, and be gently disbelieved by her colleagues, that she'd seen a huge white wolf sitting motionless in the shadows for the better part of the night, ears forward, utterly still, watching the building's 4th-floor windows. William never confirmed it. He didn't have to. Daniel knew him well enough by then to understand that some part of him, the oldest and least civilized part, had simply needed to stand guard the only way it knew how, even while the rest of him held Daniel's hand in a fluorescent-lit delivery room and forgot, entirely, how to breathe. Their daughter arrived at 4:52 in the morning, furious and loud and perfect, with a small dark tuft of hair and, The nurse pointed this out with visible astonishment. Pale gold eyes that were, unmistakably, her father's. "Hi," William said to her, exactly as he had once said it, absurdly, to Daniel's stomach in a doctor's office, except this time his voice broke entirely on the word, and Daniel, exhausted, aching, happier than he had ever been in his life, reached up and wiped a tear off his fiancée's face with one shaking thumb. "We should name her something that annoys your father a little," Daniel said deliriously, and William laughed so hard he had to sit down. They named her Freya, after no one Conrad would recognize, and when he finally came to the hospital 2 days later, awkward, stiff, carrying a ridiculous enormous stuffed wolf that he clearly had no idea how to present, and looked down into the bassinet at his granddaughter's pale gold eyes, for the first time something in his face did at last begin slowly and imperfectly to thaw. "She has the eyes," Conrad said, quiet, almost to himself. "She has her father's eyes," Daniel said, watching him carefully. "And she's going to grow up hearing every story about how brave he was to choose the people he loved over the people who tried to control him. I hope, for your own sake, you're planning to be a part of those stories, and not the villain in them." Conrad didn't answer, not that day. But he came back the following week, and the week after that, and by the time Freya was 3 months old, he had, grudgingly, wordlessly, in the specific stubborn manner of a man who would rather choke than apologize outright, started addressing Daniel by his first name instead of Mr. Ferris. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite peace, either. But it was, Daniel understood, the only kind of surrender a man like Conrad Falkenrath knew how to offer, and he decided, for Freya's sake and William's, to accept it as one. They married in October, exactly 1 year after a glass of wine had gone down the front of a stranger's coat, in the same ballroom at the Palais Ferdinand where they'd met. William's request, made with a wry, unguarded smile that still, a year on, undid Daniel completely every time he saw it. The ballroom had been transformed for the occasion, white orchids climbing every column. The same flower Daniel had been carrying the night they met, chosen deliberately, arranged by Daniel's own hands the morning of the ceremony because some things, he'd told Mira, you simply didn't trust to anyone else. Late afternoon, light slanted gold through the tall windows, catching the chandeliers until the whole room seemed to shimmer faintly, and somewhere near the doors, Felix could be heard loudly informing anyone who would listen that he had, in fact, called this outcome a full year ago, practically to the week. The old law was read aloud by Greta Ostberg herself, who insisted on officiating and who spent most of the ceremony looking extremely pleased with herself, as though she personally were responsible for every good decision either of them had made. Conrad sat in the front row, Freya asleep against his shoulder, and when William turned to him mid-ceremony, an old pack tradition, asking the family patriarch's blessing aloud, one William had genuinely not expected to bother performing. Given everything, Conrad rose, cleared his throat twice, and said gruffly to the entire assembled hall, "I was wrong about the coat." There was a beat of confused silence. "I don't." William started. "The night you two met," Conrad said, visibly uncomfortable, visibly determined to finish the thought anyway. "I heard about it, of course, before I ever met him properly. A florist's boy ruins the Alpha heir's coat at a gala. I thought, this is a disaster, this is an omen, this will end badly." He looked, for one unguarded moment, directly at Daniel. "I was wrong. It was the best thing that ever happened to this family, and I was too proud and too afraid to say so until my granddaughter had your eyes and your stubbornness in equal measure, and I finally understood I was going to lose all three of you if I didn't." He cleared his throat again, gruffer still. "Daniel, welcome to the family. Try not to set anything else on fire. That's still William's job, apparently." The whole hall laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Daniel, standing at the altar in front of everyone who had once doubted he belonged there, felt something in his chest finally, fully unclench. When William kissed him a few minutes later, hands framing Daniel's face exactly the way they had in a doctor's office 8 months before, exactly the way they would, Daniel already suspected, for the rest of both their lives, the whole ballroom erupted into applause loud enough to wake Freya, who added her own indignant wail to the celebration, and William laughed against Daniel's mouth, breathless, delighted. "She sounds like you," William murmured. "Dramatic entrances. Impeccable timing. She sounds like you," Daniel corrected. "When someone sets your roses on fire, that was one time. It was going to become a pattern. I could tell." "Marry me," William said, which was absurd, since Daniel just had ring and vows and everything, but Daniel understood exactly what he meant. Not a question, but a promise, renewed, the same one William had made on his knees in a doctor's office, with his forehead pressed to Daniel's stomach. "I cannot picture a single year of my life from this point forward that doesn't have you standing in the middle of it." "Every year," Daniel said, "for the rest of both our lives." Outside the tall windows of the Palais Ferdinand, October settled gold and quiet over Vienna, and somewhere far off in the Tyrolean mountains, in the old black forests where the Falkenrath pack had run on 4 legs for 300 years, the season's first snow began softly to fall. Morning light spilled gold and unhurried across the kitchen table, catching the steam off 2 mugs of coffee gone slowly cold, a scatter of picture books, and the small chaos of toast crumbs that seemed, these days, to follow their daughter everywhere she went, like a tiny, buttery weather system. "You're doing it again," Daniel said, without looking up from the crossword. "Doing what?" "Vibrating. It's your jealous vibrating. I can feel it from here." William, seated across the breakfast table of their Innsbruck apartment with 2-year-old Freya on his knee attempting, with great determination, to feed him a piece of buttered toast that was mostly ending up in his hair, did not deny it. "The new florist you hired," William said, with the studied casualness of a man who was not, in fact, casual about this at all. "Smiled at you for 4 full seconds this morning when he handed you the delivery slip. He smiled at me because I'm his boss, William, and because I told him a joke about tulip bulbs. It was a good joke. I don't like the tulip bulb joke. You've never heard the tulip bulb joke. I don't need to hear it. I can tell from your face that it's charming, and I resent it." Daniel put down the crossword entirely to stare at his husband, who was 2 years into marriage, one very successful reconciliation with his father, and full possession of a title that had, against every prediction Conrad had once made, only grown stronger for having Daniel standing openly beside him, and who was at this exact moment glowering at a piece of toast as though it had personally wronged him. "You," Daniel said, delighted, "are going to be jealous of the mailman next. Aren't you? The mailman has been suspiciously friendly. He says good morning." "Exactly." Freya, apparently deciding the conversation had gone on long enough without her direct participation, smacked the remaining toast directly into William's cheek with a small, triumphant shriek of laughter, and William, Alpha King of Tyrol, heir to 3 centuries of cold marble composure, a man who had once thrown his own father's antique desk into a fireplace, simply closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and accepted his fate with the weary dignity of a man who had clearly done this exact bit before. From the hallway came the sound of the front door opening, followed by Felix's voice, entirely too cheerful for the hour. "I let myself in. Your doorman likes me now. It's a whole thing. Is that butter in your hair, William? Do I want to know?" "No," William said, without opening his eyes. "You do not. Conrad's coming by at 11, by the way. Something about a rocking horse he apparently bought Freya against everyone's advice. I saw it in the car. It's the size of an actual horse." "Of course it is," Daniel said, laughing into William's shoulder. "He's been trying to win the favorite grandparent title since March. Mira's mother brought Freya a puppet theater last week. It's an arms race." "Let him," William murmured, catching Daniel's hand again, pressing a kiss to his knuckles, toast crumbs and all. "After everything, I think he's earned the right to spoil her a little too much. We can survive one oversized rocking horse. You said that about the piano. The piano was a mistake. I stand by the rocking horse." Felix wandered into the kitchen a moment later, took one look at the scene. Freya triumphant with toast, William buttered and unbothered, Daniel laughing so hard he'd had to set down his coffee, and simply pulled out a chair, poured himself a cup no one had offered him, and said, with the deep satisfaction of a man who had in fact called every part of this a year before it happened, "This is still, genuinely, my favorite show in Vienna. Better than the opera. I've stopped renewing my opera subscription, actually. This is cheaper and funnier." "Get your own family to torment," William said, without any real heat, reaching over to steal Felix's coffee purely on principle. "I have decided you're it," Felix said. "You should be honored. I could have chosen literally anyone in this city, and I chose the man who once set a bouquet on fire out of jealousy." "It was one time," William said, for what Daniel privately suspected would not be the last time in either of their lives. "It's never one time with you," Daniel said, kissing his cheek, "and I wouldn't change a single, ridiculous, overprotective, occasionally arsonist inch of it." Outside the kitchen window, the Tyrolean sun climbed higher over rooftops silvered with the last of the season's frost. And inside, in a kitchen full of coffee and crumbs and laughter, the Alpha King of Tyrol sat with butter in his hair, his daughter on his knee, his husband's hand warm in his own, and thought, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that of every title he had ever been born into, none of them had ever felt half as much like home as this one, entirely chosen, entirely his. "I regret," he informed the room at large, butter sliding slowly down his jaw, "every single choice that led me to this breakfast table." "You regret nothing," Daniel said, already laughing, already crossing the kitchen to wipe the toast off his husband's face with a dish towel, pressing a kiss to his temple on the way. "You'd burn the whole world down again tomorrow for either one of us, and don't think I don't know it." William caught his wrist before he could pull away, tugging him down for a proper kiss instead, unhurried and soft and entirely unbothered by the fact that his 2-year-old daughter was now attempting to climb his shoulder like a small, determined mountaineer. "Every time," William agreed quietly, against his mouth, "every single time, coat, council, crown, or breakfast table, it was always going to be you." Outside, the Tyrolean morning was bright and cold and utterly ordinary, snow still clinging to the mountain peaks in the distance, the kind of quiet, golden domestic morning that neither of them once, standing in a smoke-filled ballroom a lifetime ago, could have possibly predicted for themselves. And both of them, toast-smeared and laughing and thoroughly, permanently chosen, agreed it was very much worth having spilled the wine. Morning light spilled gold and unhurried across the kitchen table, catching the steam off 2 mugs of coffee gone slowly cold, a scatter of picture books, and the small chaos of toast crumbs that seemed, these days, to follow their daughter everywhere she went, like a tiny, buttery weather system. "You're doing it again," Daniel said, without looking up from the crossword. "Doing what?" "Vibrating. It's your jealous vibrating. I can feel it from here." William, seated across the breakfast table of their Innsbruck apartment, with 2-year-old Freya on his knee attempting, with great determination, to feed him a piece of buttered toast that was mostly ending up in his hair, did not deny it. "The new florist you hired," William said, with the studied casualness of a man who was not, in fact, casual about this at all, "smiled at you for 4 full seconds this morning when he handed you the delivery slip. He smiled at me because I'm his boss, William, and because I told him a joke about tulip bulbs. It was a good joke." "I don't like the tulip bulb joke. You've never heard the tulip bulb joke. I don't need to hear it. I can tell from your face that it's charming, and I resent it." Daniel put down the crossword entirely to stare at his husband, who was 2 years into marriage, one very successful reconciliation with his father, and full possession of a title that had, against every prediction Conrad had once made, only grown stronger for having Daniel standing openly beside him, and who was, at this exact moment, glowering at a piece of toast, as though it had personally wronged him. "You," Daniel said, delighted, "are going to be jealous of the mailman next, aren't you? The mailman has been suspiciously friendly. He says good morning." "Exactly." Freya, apparently deciding the conversation had gone on long enough without her direct participation, smacked the remaining toast directly into William's cheek with a small triumphant shriek of laughter, and William, Alpha King of Tyrol, heir to 3 centuries of cold marble composure, a man who had once thrown his own father's antique desk into a fireplace, simply closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and accepted his fate with the weary dignity of a man who had clearly done this exact bit before. From the hallway came the sound of the front door opening, followed by Felix's voice, entirely too cheerful for the hour. "I let myself in. Your doorman likes me now. It's a whole thing." "Is that butter in your hair, William, do I want to know?" "No," William said, without opening his eyes. "You do not. Conrad's coming by at 11, by the way. Something about a rocking horse he apparently bought Freya against everyone's advice. I saw it in the car. It's the size of an actual horse." "Of course it is," Daniel said, laughing into William's shoulder. "He's been trying to win the favorite grandparent title since March. Mira's mother brought Freya a puppet theater last week. It's an arms race." "Let him," William murmured, catching Daniel's hand again, pressing a kiss to his knuckles, toast crumbs and all. "After everything, I think he's earned the right to spoil her a little too much. We can survive one oversized rocking horse. You said that about the piano." "The piano was a mistake. I stand by the rocking horse." Felix wandered into the kitchen a moment later, took one look at the scene. Freya triumphant with toast, William buttered and unbothered, Daniel laughing so hard he'd had to set down his coffee, and simply pulled out a chair, poured himself a cup no one had offered him, and said, with the deep satisfaction of a man who had, in fact, called every part of this a year before it happened, "This is still, genuinely, my favorite show in Vienna. Better than the opera. I've stopped renewing my opera subscription. Actually, this is cheaper and funnier." "Get your own family to torment," William said, without any real heat, reaching over to steal Felix's coffee purely on principle. "I have decided you're it," Felix said. "You should be honored. I could have chosen literally anyone in this city, and I chose the man who once set a bouquet on fire out of jealousy." "It was one time," William said, for what Daniel privately suspected would not be the last time in either of their lives. "It's never one time with you," Daniel said, kissing his cheek. "And I wouldn't change a single ridiculous, overprotective, occasionally arsonist inch of it." Outside the kitchen window, the Tyrolean sun climbed higher over rooftops silvered with the last of the season's frost, and inside, in a kitchen full of coffee and crumbs and laughter, the Alpha King of Tyrol sat with butter in his hair, his daughter on his knee, his husband's hand warm in his own, and thought, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that of every title he had ever been born into, none of them had ever felt half as much like home as this one, entirely chosen, entirely his. "I regret," he informed the room at large, butter sliding slowly down his jaw, "every single choice that led me to this breakfast table." "You regret nothing," Daniel said, already laughing, already crossing the kitchen to wipe the toast off his husband's face with a dish towel, pressing a kiss to his temple on the way. "You'd burn the whole world down again tomorrow for either one of us, and don't think I don't know it." William caught his wrist before he could pull away, tugging him down for a proper kiss instead, unhurried and soft and entirely unbothered by the fact that his 2-year-old daughter was now attempting to climb his shoulder like a small, determined mountaineer. "Every time," William agreed quietly, against his mouth. "Every single time. Coat, council, crown, or breakfast table. It was always going to be you." Outside, the Tyrolean morning was bright and cold and utterly ordinary. Snow still clinging to the mountain peaks in the distance, the kind of quiet, golden domestic morning that neither of them, once, standing in a smoke-filled ballroom a lifetime ago, could have possibly predicted for themselves, and both of them, toast-smeared and laughing and thoroughly permanently chosen, agreed it was very much worth having spilled the wine. The end. Bonus story. The first snow of winter. 3 years later. By the time Freya turned 5, the Falkenrath household had acquired a second small chaos generator named Otto. No relation to the prenatal class Otto, a fact William insisted on clarifying to literally everyone who asked, as though the universe might otherwise confuse a golden retriever puppy with a man who had once tried to give Daniel a shoulder massage. Otto the dog had been Conrad's idea, which was, in itself, a measure of how far the old man had come. He'd arrived at the Innsbruck house one Sunday in November with a squirming ball of golden fur tucked under one arm and the sheepish, defensive posture of a man who fully expected to be told no. "Every pack heir should grow up with a dog," he'd announced, setting the puppy down in the front hall, where it immediately knocked over an umbrella stand and then looked deeply pleased with itself. "It teaches responsibility, also loyalty, also," he'd cleared his throat gruffly, not quite meeting Daniel's eyes. "I thought Freya might like something soft to hold while the new baby settles in." That last part had made Daniel go very still, one hand drifting instinctively to the small and still secret curve just beginning beneath his sweater, because they hadn't told anyone yet, not Felix, not Mira, not even Freya, and Conrad, apparently, had simply known, the way old wolves seemed to know things no one had said aloud, a fact that both unnerved Daniel and, 3 years into marriage, no longer entirely surprised him. How, Daniel had asked later, once Conrad had gone, and Freya was upstairs introducing Otto to every single one of her stuffed animals in a ceremony that appeared to have strict, if incomprehensible, rules. "Did your father know before I'd even told you?" William, arms wrapped around him from behind, chin hooked over his shoulder, had laughed low against his ear. "He's been sniffing around you differently for 2 weeks. Pack thing. I didn't want to say anything until you were ready to. You knew?" "I suspected." Strongly. "I bought 3 pregnancy tests and hid them in my sock drawer in case you needed them and didn't want to ask." "That's the least romantic thing you've ever said to me. I also bought flowers, William said, wounded. The tests were a practical gesture. The flowers were romance. You work for a flower shop's husband. The flowers don't count. They're basically office supplies. They absolutely count, William said, scandalized, and Daniel laughed so hard he had to sit down on the stairs, one hand pressed to his stomach, thinking, not for the first time, that this ridiculous man had somehow become, over 3 winters, the single easiest thing in his entire life to love. The first proper snowfall came 2 weeks later, blanketing the black pines around the estate in white, until the whole valley looked, Daniel thought, standing at the nursery window with a mug of tea going cold in his hands, like something out of one of the old fairy tales Conrad had started reading Freya at bedtime. Badly, gruffly, occasionally stopping to explain, entirely unprompted, the accurate pack law implications of whatever the wolf in the story had just done, which Freya found endlessly fascinating and Daniel found endlessly funny. Papa! Papa, come see! Freya's voice carried up the stairwell at a volume that suggested the entire household, possibly the entire village, needed to be informed immediately of the snow's existence. Daniel found her in the front hall already wrestling her boots on the wrong feet, Otto spinning in delighted circles around her, and William standing in the doorway in his coat, looking, for a man who ran an international shipping empire, and sat on a council of 9 terrifying elders, distinctly like he had no idea what he'd agreed to. She wants to build a wolf, William explained faintly. Not a snowman, a snow wolf. She's been very specific about the anatomy. It needs 4 legs, Papa, not 2. Wolves don't stand on 2 legs unless they're being silly, Freya informed him, with the crushing patience of a 5-year-old explaining something obvious to an adult who was clearly struggling. I stand on 2 legs, William said. You're being silly right now, Freya said, and marched out the front door into the snow, with the absolute confidence of a small general leading a campaign, Otto bounding after her, leaving William standing in the hall looking so thoroughly, helplessly outmaneuvered that Daniel had to press a hand over his own mouth to keep from laughing out loud. I don't know how to build a 4-legged snow wolf, William admitted quietly to Daniel, as if confessing something shameful. You're the Alpha King of Tyrol. You've read 4 books on massage technique. You'll figure it out. That's not the same skill set. Go find out, Daniel said, kissing him once, soft and brief at the corner of his mouth. I'll bring Coco. Try not to let her talk you into anything structurally unsound. It took, in the end, 40 minutes, 3 collapsed attempts, 1 entirely unnecessary debate between William and Freya about whether snow wolves should have visible ribs, for realism, Papa, and the eventual, grudging assistance of Felix, who had arrived, uninvited as always, precisely in time to be roped into snow wolf construction, and had spent the entire process narrating it like a nature documentary, to Freya's enormous delight, before a genuinely respectable 4-legged snow wolf stood in the front garden, one ear slightly larger than the other, wearing one of William's old scarves. Daniel watched from the doorway with 2 mugs of cocoa going lukewarm in his hands, snow settling in William's dark hair, Freya's laughter carrying bright and clear across the white garden, Otto barking at his own shadow, and felt something in his chest go soft and full in a way that had nothing to do with the baby, and everything to do with simply this, the specific hard-won, thoroughly ordinary happiness of a life he had once been told, in a cold dining room 3 years ago, he had no right to want. You're staring, William said, catching his eye across the garden, snow on his eyelashes, grinning in a way that still, after 3 years, made something in Daniel's stomach flip helplessly, foolishly, like the first night by the canal. I'm allowed to stare. You're my husband. It's in the contract. There was no contract. There was an entire ceremony, William, with a lawyer and everything. I checked. The lawyer was for the pack council, William said, crossing the snow to steal one of the cocoa mugs and press a cold-lipped kiss to Daniel's temple, not the marriage. The marriage was just us. It didn't need paperwork. Everything you own needs paperwork. You once made me sign a form to borrow your reading glasses. That form was a joke. It had a notary stamp, William. Felix's idea, William said with dignity, and I stand by very little of what Felix convinces me to do, but I regret none of it, because look, he nodded toward the garden, where Freya had abandoned the finished snow wolf entirely in favor of attempting to teach Otto to howl, with limited success, the dog mostly just staring at her, tail wagging, utterly delighted by the attention regardless of the actual howling. Look what we built. All of this out of a spilled glass of wine and a burnt bouquet. I'd sign 100 ridiculous forms for this. Daniel leaned into him, cocoa warm between them, snow falling soft and steady over the garden, and thought that if someone had told him 4 years ago, sweeping up smoke and ash in a flower shop with his heart hammering against his ribs, that this was where all that chaos would eventually lead, he would never, not for a single second, have believed them capable of describing anything so completely, improbably happy. That night, once Freya had been talked down from 3 separate requests for just 5 more minutes of Snowwolf supervision, bathed, and finally installed in bed with Otto curled loyally at her feet and a book about, at her specific insistence, a wolf who becomes a king but is actually very silly about it, a description that made William choke on his tea when he overheard it. Daniel found his husband on the back terrace, coat open despite the cold, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains, against a sky gone thick with stars. "You'll freeze," Daniel said, coming up beside him, tucking himself under William's arm the way he had 1,000 times before and never once tired of. "Wolves run warm. I've told you this. You're not currently a wolf." "Close enough," William said, but he pulled Daniel in tighter anyway, chin resting against the top of his head, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, just stood there together in the cold, watching their breath fog into the dark. "Are you scared?" William asked eventually. Quiet, careful, one hand splayed protectively over the small curve of Daniel's stomach. "About the new one. It's different this time. We know what we're walking into now. Last time we were terrified and improvising. This time we actually know how hard it can get." Daniel considered this honestly. The way he tried to consider everything William asked him with real weight, rather than reaching automatically for reassurance. "A little," he admitted. "Not about your father anymore." He brought a dog and started reading bedtime stories. "I think we're safely past that particular war. Mostly I'm scared about sleep. I remember what the first 6 months were like. I aged visibly." "You looked beautiful the entire time," William said, with such immediate, unthinking sincerity that Daniel laughed despite himself. "I had a permanent stain on my shirt for 4 months, William. A beautiful stain." "You are the single worst liar I have ever loved," Daniel said, delighted, turning in his arms to look up at him properly, snow-dusted and starlit and so unbearably dear that Daniel sometimes still couldn't quite believe his own luck. "But for the record, no. I'm not really scared. Not the way I was the first time, waiting to find out whether your father would let me stay. This time I already know how it ends. This time I know exactly who's going to be standing guard outside the door, 4-legged and ridiculous, whether the hospital allows it or not." "They still haven't caught me," William said, with quiet, enormous satisfaction. "They caught you once. There's a note in my chart. It says, 'Patient's husband may attempt to wait outside in wolf form. Please do not call animal control.' That note," William said, "is the single greatest honor this family has ever received." They stood together a moment longer, until the cold finally won out and they retreated indoors, and it was there, in the warm gold light of the kitchen, over a last cup of tea neither of them really needed, that Daniel remembered the other piece of chaos he'd been meaning to mention all evening. "Otto ate one of your council reports today," he said mildly, as though commenting on the weather. William went very still. "Which report?" "The one about the shipping tariffs. The important one. The one you left on the coffee table, despite me telling you 3 separate times not to leave important papers on the coffee table when there is a puppy in this house who considers paper a personal snack. That report took me 2 weeks. He got about 4 pages in before Freya caught him and took a very dramatic photograph for evidence, which she has already shown to your father, who apparently found it the single funniest thing that has happened to this family since William set fire to a bouquet." William put his tea down with the careful, controlled precision of a man attempting not to raise his voice in front of a sleeping household. "My own father is laughing at me." "Your own father," Daniel said, biting back a smile, "bought the dog. I believe the technical term is consequences. I built an entire dynasty out of discipline and self-control," William said with real wounded indignation, "and it has all been undone by one golden retriever and a 5-year-old with a very good sense of comic timing." "Welcome to parenthood," Daniel said, kissing the crease between his husband's eyebrows until it finally slowly smoothed out into something closer to reluctant laughter. "It only gets more undignified from here. I hear the next one comes with even less respect for important paperwork. I regret everything, William said, without an ounce of actual regret in his voice, pulling Daniel close again. And I would not trade a single ruined report for any version of my life that doesn't have all of you in it. That's the least dignified thing you've said all night. It's also, William murmured against his hair, the truest. Inside, upstairs, a small girl slept soundly with a golden dog curled at her feet, dreaming, quite possibly, of silly wolf kings and four-legged snowmen. And outside, under a sky full of winter stars, her fathers stood wrapped around each other in the cold, in no particular hurry to go back in, thoroughly, permanently, ridiculously happy.